Rest assured, if there's a scene of Nico Robin flying around in the air, the animators are going to do everything in their power to make it as blatant, suggestive, and sexual as possible. Setup is the name of the game in this week's episode of One Piece, which was okay, but it did have its standout moments. This episode was basically just about Luffy fighting against the Nutcrackers, who continuously just keep rebuilding themselves. You had Bartolomeo, Nico Robin, Rebecca still jumping around the kingdom, and one of the big highlights of this week's episode was getting to see the other members again of Kurita Coliseum fighting against the members of Don Quixote's family. Lao Ji versus Don Chinchao. Definitely the big badass moment of this week's episode. Despite that, I'm really looking forward to the moment with Usopp. This is a huge build-up for this character. This is going to be one of his shining moments, and the actual shot that he has to do is insane, because he's trying to take out Sugar from afar. He can't even see her. He's going to shoot through a castle, and he's actually going to have Violet help. This just reminds the audience yet again that Violet's powers are really useful, and she's another prime candidate for next Straw Hat Pirate. She could basically be the spotter for Usopp, not to mention, she can shoot whales from her eyeballs! Baby 5 is fighting against Sai, but she ends up getting his words confused and starts falling in love with him. She's a dimwit, but a lovable dimwit. One of the coolest members of Don Quixote's family, Gladius, really showed off in this week's episode, especially when he knocked Nico Robin and Bartolomeo out of the sky by throwing these bullets up into the air, which just suddenly exploded, and they both fell to the ground, with Bartolomeo hitting head first and Nico Robin just using her wing abilities. She could have helped out Bartolomeo, but it wouldn't have been as funny. The episode ends with what is literally an anime western standoff as all of these nutcrackers are getting ready to close in on them, as Nico Robin and Bartolomeo decide to stay behind, as Rebecca, Kyros, and Luffy make their way to the flower field, giving us our classic to-be-continued screen. So what's the rundown on this week's episode of One Piece? This was an okay episode for me. All the stuff at the beginning of the episode about Violet having to go to the naughty room at the back of the church, now that I say that out loud, that sounds really freaking messed up. Like, they didn't need to get into any of that at all, because that was all stuff that was hinted at in the previous episode, and basically we just didn't need to see it. It was basically just eating into the time. But I really love the build-up of Usopp getting ready to perform this big operation with his giant slingshot. I think that's going to be really awesome. I also like the scene when he was constantly pounding Kanjuro and Kinemon in the head and that made that weird noise. That was just some weird, funny, goofy stuff. Aside from that, there is a little bit of action in this episode. Lao Ji versus Don Chinchao is short, but it's awesome. It's definitely the biggest attack that we see from this week's episode, aside from Gladius, who's just bombing everything in sight. And something that I noticed about Gladius, and obviously this is connected to his power, and it's a really nice touch, is how he is always pissed. All the time. Like, he's always about to literally explode. And it could be the most minor of things, but everything just gets under his skin, and he's always ready to just go off the handle. It's really crazy, and I think that's a really nice addition to his character. That and the fact that his just whole power and moveset, I think, is really awesome, and I can't wait to see more of that in action. On the technical side of things, this week's episode looked okay. There were moments that looked good, like Don Chinchao versus Lao Ji, and then there were moments that looked a little awkward, like when Luffy was using his UFO ability and knocking his way through the Nutcrackers. It just looked kind of strange. Otherwise, this was just a fun, average episode of One Piece with some action, some humor, and some nice build-up for Usopp, so it was still pretty good. So I'm going to give this week's episode a 3 out of 5. Just a fun, average episode of One Piece that fans of the manga and anime version should definitely check out. So I like this episode a lot, but what about you guys? Did you like this week's episode of One Piece? Did you have a favorite scene, favorite action scene, favorite funny scene? Who do you want to be the next Straw Hat Pirate? Please tell me in the comment section below. Thank you guys for watching my review. Make sure to like the video, thumbs it up, share it with all your friends, and subscribe to the channel. Make sure to also follow us on social media. Thank you guys again for watching, and as always, stay dandy, baby.